Wide-angle zoom lenses have to be the most used lenses on the market, especially when it comes to content creation. And while there's a whole range of options out there from super budget to pro, this week I decided to put Canon and Sony's top of the line options to the test to see which one is actually worth over $2,000. This is the Sony FE 16-35mm f2.8 GM2 versus the Canon RF 15-35mm f2.8L IS USM. That's a lot to say. First, let's talk about the physical build of these lenses. Both are weather sealed, zoom externally, and have an 82mm filter thread. There's gonna be no need to use step-up rings with these guys. Despite having the same filter thread, the Sony is much smaller and lighter than the Canon, weighing only 547 grams compared to the Canon's 840. I wasn't sure that this would make the biggest difference in practice, but it is actually very noticeable. So for creators or hiking nature photographers that value every single gram in their pack, the Sony is the winner hands down. That said, Canon beats it on zoom range, as this is able to open up to 15mm as opposed to Sony's 16. This extra millimeter of zoom range isn't the biggest deal, but I do really enjoy being able to go that one step further into that ultra wide range when it comes to vlogging or big landscape shots. I do have to give the win in this category to Sony though, because I don't think that extra millimeter of focal range really cancels out the big size difference. Both lenses have 3 adjustable rings around their circumference. Of course, you have the typical zoom range ring and focus ring, but their third one is a little bit different. On Canon, it's a programmable input called the control ring, and you can bind any sort of command to it, from aperture to adjusting your focus zone. The Sony's third ring is dedicated to aperture, and only aperture. While you're sacrificing a little bit of flexibility here, I actually prefer this to Canon's solution, because being able to glance down at the lens and instantly tell via their written on aperture numbers what aperture I'm shooting is incredibly convenient. Sony also built in a little switch on the lens that changes the tactile feel of this ring, switching it from being smooth to being clicky so that you don't accidentally bump it out of position when you're shooting. The GM isn't totally lacking programmable features though, as it has 2 programmable buttons on the barrel. I bound these to a focus holding function that was incredible when shooting B-roll, because it enabled me to keep the autofocus on, but lock it in whenever I wanted to get a shot around an object without risking the camera pulling close focus. From a general layout standpoint, I do prefer the location of Canon's focus switch though, because it's kind of right at the top and it's very easy to see. With the Sony, it's pretty far down along the barrel and it gets lost. That said, I do still want to give the win to Sony in this category, even though it might only be a couple points, because both lenses have their strong suits and their drawbacks. It's important to remember though that your lens is only one small part of making an amazing video. Once you've shot your footage, you still have to edit it together with music and other assets, as well as color grading it from your log to the regular beautiful footage that you and I see in films. That's where today's video sponsor, Artlist, comes in. Artlist is an online library of thousands of songs, sound effects, templates, plugins, stock footage, and now color correction LUTs. Their user interface makes finding the right LUT easier than ever, with advanced filters like style, tone, saturation, temperature, and contrast. Then use a slider to see the before and after to see how it'll affect your footage. This is the most incredible integration of LUTs in a service that I've ever seen, and any of them can be used with all of your major editing softwares. On top of that, with Artlist Max, you can access hundreds of thousands of other assets like an incredible music library, sound effects, and more, all while having the peace of mind that your channel and your client productions will be completely cleared of any copyright claims. I have a link down below that'll give you 2 free months added on to any of their annual subscriptions, so if you're interested, definitely take advantage of that. Thank you, Artlist, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to talking about these wide-angle lenses. One huge drawback for Sony is that the lens lacks optical image stabilization. This is probably how they were able to make it so small and light, but it's also a big problem for some photographers. Wide-angle lenses are certainly much more forgiving than long lenses when it comes to camera shake, and cameras' eye biz nowadays are usually pretty dang good. But for anyone wanting to get low light images or long exposure shots while handheld, the Canon is going to be the way to go, because this lens is going to give you a good amount more image stabilization than simply using the IBIS on your Sony. When it comes to videos though, this feature is sort of a wash, because Canon's cameras still suffer from some absolutely awful warble when you're filming with the camera's image stabilization and the lens's image stabilization both turned on. So you really kind of are only able to use one, which brings it back down to the level of the Sony. Still, uncontested, Canon wins in image stabilization. I'm not a huge pixel peeper, and when it comes to lenses that cost over $2,000, I'm not expecting any test to reveal something that would substantially change my opinion of the lens. That said, I did a quick test on these two lenses just to be sure, and I'm really glad I did. Both these lenses look great, don't get me wrong, but the Canon does have a pretty definite edge here. I took all of these photos with exactly the same settings and at f2.8, because when you get zoom lenses in particular and you open them all the way up, that's when you start to see them fall apart a bit, especially when it comes to sharpness. The first thing I noticed was that on the Sony at 16mm, you start to see some serious sharpness fall off pretty soon after leaving the middle point of focus. I mean, on the corners, it's pretty obvious, but check out this little pine needle here. This is on the Sony, and here's the Canon. Sony, Canon. Big difference. If I peek at the corners of the Canon, you start to see some of that blur coming in, but again, it is not nearly as bad as Sony. It's also not a perfect comparison, because the Sony camera I use, the a7 IV, actually has a higher megapixel count than the Canon R6 Mark II, which is what I was shooting on with the Canon. So technically speaking, the Sony photos should be sharper because they're higher resolution. That's just not the case, and the sharpness issue persists in lessening degrees as you go up the focal range to 24mm and then 35mm, but there's definitely still some blur in the corners at 35 on Sony, while with Canon it's almost completely gone. It's sharp all the way across the image. Jumping back out to 16mm, I noticed a little bit of vignetting going on both lenses. This is kind of normal for wide angle, but there was noticeably less on the Canon, which is impressive because it's also got that 1 extra millimeter of focal length. This is a 15mm with the Canon lens versus the 16mm on the Sony. The Sony also has a bit of a cool color shift as we go into that vignette, where on the Canon it stays really neutral. You know, I want to make it clear that this is not by any means the most scientific test ever conducted, but what I'm seeing is that the Canon is substantially better when it comes to image quality than the Sony. I don't think you can argue anything otherwise. So big win for the Canon here. And my light just went out. I was trying to get this segment filmed before that happened, but I didn't, clearly. There's a few things that I didn't mention about these lenses, like autofocus, because both of them perform really well in this category, so it just wasn't worth saying. But all told, it's hard to pick a better lens because both of them are good in their own ways. If I had to choose, I would probably say that the Sony might be better for videographers and for travel photographers, just because of that small size, its dedicated aperture ring, and the control buttons. But if you're looking for the absolute best image quality, you just cannot beat Canon's RF L series glass, and that goes just the same for this 15 to 35. You can also get it for a couple $100 less than the Sony. That said, if you think it might be a bit big to travel with, I hear you, and so you should watch this video over here where I talk about my favorite RF mount lens for travel.